Linux isn't replacing Windows, and every few months someone else fires back with market share charts, proving Windows still dominates. What it's actually doing is exposing it. Exposing its design choices, exposing its business model, exposing its compromises, exposing the gap between what users think they're getting and what they're actually signing up for. It ran the software people needed. It powered businesses, schools, and gaming PCs. It became so embedded in daily computing that many users stopped seeing it as a choice. It was just the computer. When something went wrong, people blamed themselves, their hardware, or some random program. Rarely did they question the operating system itself. In data centers, on supercomputers, in Android phones, in routers. And yet on the desktop, it was dismissed as a hobbyist tool, a niche platform, something for programmers and hoodies. But as Windows evolved into a service-driven ecosystem filled with telemetry, subscriptions, forced updates, ads in the start menu, and deeper integration with cloud accounts, Linux didn't have to compete head-on. And that contrast is powerful. When a Windows update restarts someone's PC in the middle of work, Linux exposes that updates don't have to work that way. When Windows pushes ads into the interface, Linux exposes that an operating system doesn't have to monetize your attention. When Windows collects telemetry by default, Linux exposes that data collection is a choice, not a necessity. When Windows ties core features to online accounts, Linux exposes that local control is still possible. It's not about replacing, it's about revealing. The shift happening now isn't about mass migration. It's about awareness. More users are realizing that the frustrations they've normalized for years aren't universal truths of computing. Take performance, for example. They upgrade hardware every few years because the system feels heavier, more bloated, more resource-hungry. Maybe the machine wasn't the problem. Maybe the operating system was carrying weight the user never asked for. Linux doesn't magically make hardware faster. It simply doesn't burden it the same way. That difference exposes how much overhead Windows quietly accumulates. Then there's control. Windows has steadily moved toward abstraction and simplification, which sounds good on paper, but simplification often means removing transparency. System behavior becomes harder to predict. Linux, depending on the distribution, gives you visibility into almost everything. You can see what's running. Even if most users never touch those capabilities, knowing they exist changes the relationship between user and system. It feels less like renting and more like owning. Ownership is a key difference. When you buy a Windows PC today, you're stepping into an ecosystem that expects ongoing engagement. Cloud storage subscriptions, Office subscriptions. Different companies build distributions, yes, but the core remains open. No central authority decides to inject ads into your file manager. No shareholder call dictates that the next update must increase user engagement metrics. And this is where exposure becomes uncomfortable. Because once you experience an alternative, you can't unsee certain things. For years, Windows users were told that certain inconveniences were just part of modern computing. Improvement doesn't require invasive data collection. Convenience doesn't require surrendering autonomy. Recommendations don't have to appear in system menus. The gaming argument is another fascinating example. Windows long held an unchallenged position because of DirectX and broad game support. Instead, it exposed that exclusivity was more about ecosystem inertia than technical impossibility. When major titles run smoothly on Linux-based systems, the myth that Linux can't game starts to crumble. And when that myth falls, users begin questioning other assumptions too. Windows thrives in enterprise because of legacy software, centralized management tools, and decades of integration. But Linux dominates servers and cloud infrastructure for reasons that speak volumes. Stability, scalability, cost efficiency, transparency. The same companies that deploy thousands of Windows desktops often rely on Linux behind the scenes to run their web services and databases. That duality exposes a subtle truth. When performance and reliability are mission-critical, many organizations trust Linux. When user familiarity and legacy workflows dominate, they stick with Windows. It's not about superiority in a vacuum. It's about context and priorities. Windows has improved dramatically over the years, yet it remains the primary target for malware simply because of its ubiquity. Installing software from centralized repositories reduces the wild west of random executable downloads. Linux users, accustomed to package managers, often look at that practice with disbelief. The user experience debate is equally revealing. Critics argue that Linux desktops lack the polish of Windows. Sometimes that's true, depending on the distribution. But the flip side is flexibility. Windows offers a single official interface vision. Linux offers many. GNOME, KDE, Plasma, Cinnamon, XFCE. Each reflects different philosophies: minimalism, customizability, familiarity, efficiency. The existence of choice exposes how rigid a single vendor approach can be. It shows that user interface design isn't one size fits all. But perhaps the most significant exposure is philosophical. Roadmaps align with business objectives, features serve strategic goals. Linux represents a decentralized, community-influenced model. Even when companies like Red Hat, Canonical, or SUSE play major roles, the ecosystem remains distributed. Code can be forked. That decentralization exposes how much power users relinquish in tightly controlled ecosystems. In 2026, privacy concerns are no longer niche topics. Windows integration with online services and telemetry frameworks stands in contrast to many Linux distributions that prioritize minimal data collection by default. Linux doesn't automatically make someone anonymous, but it exposes the extent to which mainstream operating systems intertwine with cloud analytics. Even the installation process tells a story. You choose partitions, you select environments, you define users. Installing Windows feels more like registering a product. One emphasizes configuration, the other emphasizes onboarding. This isn't to romanticize Linux or demonize Windows. Linux has its own challenges: hardware compatibility quirks, fragmentation, steeper learning curves for certain tasks. But those limitations don't negate its role as a mirror that reflects what computing could look like under different priorities. The reason Linux isn't replacing Windows is simple. It's an ecosystem of devices, services, and workflows. Many users will continue using Windows because it fits their needs. Others will adopt Linux for specific roles. Some will dual boot, some will switch back and forth. The real shift isn't migration numbers, it's perception. When users try Linux even briefly, they gain perspective. They see that forced restarts aren't inevitable. They see that system customization can go deeper than changing wallpapers. They see that software can be installed without hunting across the web. They see that updates can be transparent. That perspective changes how they view Windows, even if they return to it. Exposure doesn't require dominance. It requires visibility, and visibility is increasing. The Steam Deck runs Linux. Chromebooks are Linux-based. Developers rely heavily on Linux environments. WSL brings Linux into Windows itself. Ironically, Windows now embeds Linux tools to stay relevant for developers. That integration is telling. It acknowledges that Linux offers strengths Windows alone couldn't replicate quickly enough. Instead of replacing Windows, Linux is influencing it from within. Windows has adopted package managers, improved terminal environments, enhanced subsystem support. Many of these changes mirror capabilities long standard in Linux. That's exposure turning into adaptation. Competition, or even coexistence, drives evolution. So when people argue about whether Linux will finally overtake Windows on the desktop, they're asking the wrong question. The more important question is what Linux's presence forces Windows to confront: user dissatisfaction, privacy expectations, performance demands, developer workflows, open standards. Linux doesn't need 90% market share to matter. It needs enough users to maintain momentum, enough developers to keep building, enough visibility to remind the industry that alternatives exist. That reminder alone shifts power dynamics, because once users know they have options, they negotiate differently, they criticize more openly, they demand better features, they resist intrusive changes. Linux's mere availability strengthens user leverage across the ecosystem. In that sense, Linux isn't the challenger trying to overthrow a king. It's the whistleblower revealing the flaws in the kingdom's design. It highlights the trade-offs. It questions assumptions. It demonstrates that different priorities produce different outcomes. Windows may remain dominant for years to come, but it can no longer operate unchallenged in narrative. The idea that this is just how computers work no longer holds. Linux proves otherwise every day. And that's the real story of 2026. Not a revolution, not a takeover, not a collapse, just a gradual awakening. A realization that operating systems are philosophies encoded into software. Windows encodes one philosophy, Linux encodes another. And by existing side by side, they expose each other. Linux isn't replacing Windows, it's revealing it.